What if the greatest pirate treasure is not a chest of gold, but an entire city that history tried to drown? What if its ghost is not a spectral galleon, but an eternal question about the price of freedom and the nature of greed? Deep beneath the turquoise waters of the Caribbean, off the coast of modern-day Jamaica, lies a secret. It is not a reef, not a wreck, but a sprawling metropolis of the dead. Its streets are paved with silt, its houses are home to coral, and its silence is deeper than any grave. This is Port Royal, once called the wickedest city on earth. Why did the British Empire, the most powerful maritime nation of its time, not only tolerate but actively encourage the creation of a city that was, in essence, a sovereign pirate state, an anomalous economic zone built on terror and plunder? And how could this city, a fortress of brick and stone, vanish in less than 3 minutes, swallowed by the very sand it was built upon, a geological anomaly that defies simple explanation? The story of Port Royal is not merely one of history, it is a warning, a tale of a social experiment so extreme, so drenched in blood and rum, that the planet itself seemed to rebel against its existence. The birth of this monster was an act of desperate political calculus. In the year 1655, an English fleet, having failed in its primary objective to capture Hispaniola from the Spanish, limped towards the less defended island of Jamaica. They took it, but holding it was another matter entirely. Spain, a wounded but still colossal empire, was not about to let this strategic jewel slip from its grasp without a fight. England, its navy stretched thin across the globe, lacked the ships and soldiers to properly fortify its new prize. So the governor of Jamaica made a deal with the devil. He sent out an open invitation, a royal decree whispered on the winds of the Caribbean, to a class of men the Spanish feared more than any army, the brethren of the coast, buccaneers, privateers, cutthroats, and pirates. They were offered a safe harbor, a place to sell their stolen goods without question, a place to spend their blood-soaked silver with abandon. They were offered Port Royal. In a breathtakingly short time, the quiet English outpost exploded. It became a throbbing, chaotic, and unimaginably wealthy boomtown. The city was built on a long, thin sand spit, a precarious finger of land barely connected to the Jamaican mainland, almost as if it were trying to float away into the lawless sea. It was a strategic masterstroke, commanding the shipping lanes to the Spanish Main. Any Spanish galleon laden with silver from the mines of Peru had to pass by this hornet's nest. The pirates of Port Royal were not disorganized thugs. They were a de facto navy, an outsourced weapon of terror that England could deploy against its Catholic rival while maintaining a thin veil of plausible deniability. The gold and silver of the Spanish Empire, extracted with the sweat and blood of indigenous peoples, was violently rerouted, flowing not to Madrid, but into the taverns and brothels of this new Caribbean Sodom. Every raid brought a fresh wave of wealth, turning the city into a spectacle of opulence and depravity. Imagine its streets, not dusty lanes, but thoroughfares paved with the refuse of extravagant consumption, where merchants in silk coats haggled with pirates, still smelling of gunpowder and saltwater. Towering 2- and 3-story brick houses, a sign of immense wealth and a fatal architectural miscalculation, lined the waterfront. 1 out of every 4 buildings was either a tavern or a brothel. Rum, the fuel of the pirate engine, was cheaper than water. The air was thick with the cries of vendors, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers forging cutlasses, the laughter of gamblers, and the ever-present threat of a duel breaking out over a misplaced word or a coveted piece of loot. Could you thrive in a city where every coin was stained with violence, where life was cheap and treasure was the only god? This was not just a city, it was a living organism, a predator with a ravenous appetite, and its hunger was about to reshape the balance of power in the New World. It was a city that built its walls on Spanish gold, not knowing that the very foundation beneath it was keeping a silent, unforgiving tally of every sin. The city's wealth was legendary, almost mythical. In the 1660s, a simple craftsman in Port Royal could earn more in a week than his counterpart in London could in a year. The sheer concentration of capital was staggering. Ships arrived daily, their holds not filled with cotton or sugar, but with silver bars, gold doubloons, precious jewels, and fine silk stripped from Spanish vessels. The pirates, often operating under the guise of privateers, with letters of marque from the English governor, would return from their bloody expeditions and spend their fortunes with a speed that bespoke a deep-seated understanding that they would likely not live to see old age. A single successful raid could net a common sailor a lifetime's wages, and it would be gone in a matter of days, poured into wine, women, and dice. This relentless, frenetic circulation of stolen wealth created a bizarre and unstable economy, attracting not just pirates but also merchants, artisans, and tradesmen from across the globe, all eager to get their share of the devil's bounty. The architecture of the city reflected its hubris. Unlike the wooden shanty towns common in the colonies, Port Royal boasted grand brick structures mimicking the fashionable styles of London. Warehouses bulged with plunder, and the homes of wealthy merchants and pirate captains were filled with the finest furniture, Chinese porcelain, and silver tableware, all of it, of course, liberated from its original owners. This display of permanence of solid, respectable brick and mortar was a profound act of defiance. It was a declaration that this pirate haven was no temporary camp, but a permanent fixture, a new center of commerce and power in the Americas. They built their city as if it were to last 1,000 years on a foundation of sand that could not even last 30. It was the ultimate gamble, a city betting its very existence against the laws of physics and morality. Every new building that rose was another card played in a high-stakes game they could not possibly win. Life in Port Royal was a study in extreme contrasts. On one hand, there was the raw, untamed brutality. Disputes were settled with swords, and the gallows near the shoreline at Gallows Point were a constant, grim reminder of the Crown's nominal authority. Yet on the other hand, a complex social order emerged. The pirates themselves lived by a strict code, the Articles of Agreement, which dictated the division of spoils, compensation for injuries, and rules of conduct during a voyage. This democratic, almost socialistic system stood in stark opposition to the rigid hierarchies of the naval and merchant ships of the era. On board a pirate vessel, the captain was elected, and he could be deposed by a vote. This paradox was the essence of Port Royal, a society of outlaws who created their own intricate laws, a den of thieves that operated with a strange and brutal form of honor. The atmosphere was one of perpetual, feverish celebration, a city living on borrowed time and knowing it. The constant threat of a Spanish counterattack, of disease, of a drunken quarrel turning deadly, meant that life was lived entirely in the present moment. There was no thought for tomorrow. Why save your gold when a Spanish cannonball or a tropical fever could claim you before sunrise? This philosophy permeated every aspect of life, turning the city into a relentless carnival of excess. They feasted and fought and fornicated as if the apocalypse was scheduled for the following week, little knowing how horrifyingly accurate that premonition would turn out to be. The city was a powder keg of human ambition, greed, and desperation, and it was attracting a man who would not just light the fuse, but who would become the living embodiment of Port Royal itself, a ruthless pirate who would one day govern the very city he helped build on blood and fear. The chaos needed a king, and a Welshman was on his way to claim the throne. What do you think motivated the people of this city more, the intoxicating lure of immense wealth or the absolute thrill of unrestrained freedom? Share your opinion in the comments below. Your choice reveals the true currency of a pirate's soul. That Welshman was Henry Morgan, a name that would become a legend, a brand, a symbol of the pirate mythos for centuries to come. But the man himself was no romantic rogue with a twinkle in his eye. He was a brilliant military strategist, a master of psychological warfare, and a man of unquenchable ambition and chilling ruthlessness. Morgan did not just participate in the pirate economy of Port Royal, he industrialized it. He transformed the hit-and-run raids of individual captains into massive, coordinated military campaigns, assembling vast fleets of pirate ships and leading armies of thousands against the most heavily fortified cities in the Spanish Empire. He arrived in the Caribbean as a young man of obscure origins, but he possessed a genius for violence and leadership that Port Royal recognized and rewarded. He understood the city's soul because it mirrored his own, hungry, audacious, and utterly without mercy. The city was his weapon, and he wielded it with devastating precision. Morgan's genius lay in his audacity. He attacked targets that the Spanish considered impregnable. In 1668, he led his men on an overland march to sack the city of Portobello, one of the most important Spanish trading centers. They took the city by surprise, using captured priests and nuns as human shields to approach the fortress walls, a tactic so brutal it shocked even the hardened world of the 17th century. The ransom and loot from Portobello were immense, and when Morgan's fleet returned to Port Royal, the city erupted in a celebration of such epic proportions that it was said the island itself shook. He followed this with an even more daring raid on Maracaibo and Gibraltar in 1669, escaping a trap set by the Spanish Navy by using a fireship in a brilliant display of tactical cunning. With each victory, his legend grew, and more pirates flocked to his banner. He was becoming more than a captain. He was a king, and Port Royal was his kingdom. The pinnacle of his career and the ultimate expression of Port Royal's power was the assault on Panama in 1671. It was the boldest military operation in the history of piracy. Assembling a fleet of 36 ships and nearly 2,000 buccaneers, Morgan landed on the isthmus and led his army on a grueling 9-day march through dense, disease-ridden jungle. Starving and exhausted, they finally emerged to face a Spanish force defending the richest city in the New World. In the open field battle that followed, Morgan's disciplined, battle-hardened pirates utterly crushed the Spanish professional soldiers. They took Panama and burned it to the ground, stripping it of every last piece of gold, silver, and jewelry. The treasure caravan that snaked its way back through the jungle was one of the richest in history. It was a wound from which the Spanish Empire in the Americas would never fully recover. Port Royal had, in effect, broken the back of its greatest enemy. But this triumph was also the beginning of the end. The sack of Panama, conducted after a peace treaty, had officially been signed between England and Spain, was a major international incident. To appease the furious Spanish, King Charles II of England had Henry Morgan arrested and brought back to London in chains. The pirates of Port Royal felt a cold chill. Had their protector, the Crown, finally abandoned them? But what happened next was the city's greatest and most bitter irony. Instead of being executed in the Tower of London, Henry Morgan, the pirate, the terrorist, the scourge of the Spanish Main, used his immense wealth and charisma to charm London society. He was not only pardoned, but knighted by the king. And then, in an act of breathtaking cynicism, he was sent back to Jamaica, not as a prisoner, but as its lieutenant governor. Sir Henry Morgan, the man who had perfected piracy, was now tasked with eradicating it. His transformation encapsulates the profound hypocrisy at the heart of Port Royal. The city had served its purpose. It had been England's cudgel against Spain, but now, with Spanish power waning, the wild, chaotic pirate state had become a liability, an embarrassment to an empire that wanted to be seen as civilized. Governor Morgan began hunting his former comrades with the same ruthless efficiency he had once used to hunt Spanish galleons. Many were caught and hung from the same gallows where they had once celebrated their victories. The city began to change. Wealthy merchants and plantation owners gained more influence. Churches were built. An effort was made to impose a veneer of respectability over the city's rotten core. Port Royal was at the peak of its wealth and influence, a jewel of the English crown. But it was a city built on a contradiction, a society poisoned by its own origins. In Port Royal, the only difference between a pirate and a governor was a piece of paper from London, and everyone knew it. The city, fat with gold and arrogance, believed itself to be invincible, the master of the seas. It never occurred to its inhabitants that the real threat was not an enemy fleet appearing on the horizon, but the silent, patient, and unforgiving ground beneath their very feet. The appointment of Sir Henry Morgan as Lieutenant Governor marked a profound shift in the city's identity. The raw, anarchic energy that had fueled its rise began to curdle into a form of decadent, state-sanctioned corruption. The line between pirate and politician, always blurry, now vanished completely. Morgan and his cronies, the former pirate captains who now styled themselves as respectable plantation owners and members of the Jamaican Assembly, ran the island like their personal fiefdom. They used their political power to protect their vast, ill-gotten fortunes and to continue exploiting the system, just with more sophisticated methods. The city's economy diversified from pure plunder to include the slave trade and sugar plantations, industries no less brutal but considered more legitimate. Port Royal became a hub for the transatlantic slave trade, adding another layer of human suffering to its foundations. Its wealth continued to grow, but the wild spirit, the dangerous freedom of its early days, was being paved over with a veneer of colonial civility. The city's physical form reflected this change. More and more land was reclaimed from the harbour, a process of driving wooden piles into the seabed and filling the space with refuse and sand. On this unstable, artificial ground, they built ever larger and more ostentatious buildings. Fort James, Fort Carlisle, and Fort Rupert, bristling with cannons, guarded the entrance to the harbour, making the city one of the most heavily fortified locations in the Americas. A grand Anglican church, St. Paul's, was constructed, its spire reaching towards a heaven that seemed to have little interest in the city's affairs. The population swelled to over 6,500 souls, a diverse mix of English, Welsh, Irish, Scots, Africans, French and Spanish Jews, all drawn by the magnetic pull of wealth. Port Royal was a cosmopolitan metropolis, a testament to the power of global commerce, albeit a commerce lubricated by theft and human misery. Yet beneath the surface of this prosperous, bustling city, a deep sense of unease lingered. The old generation of pirates, men who had sailed with Morgan, watched with contempt as the city they had built became something they no longer recognized. They saw the merchants and politicians as soft, hypocritical parasites who had grown rich on the risks the buccaneers had taken. The city was divided. There were the new elite who wanted to erase the city's sordid past, and the old guard who remembered the good old days of untamed lawlessness. Taverns still buzzed with drunken brawls, and the port remained a dangerous place after dark, but the city's soul was in conflict with itself. It wanted to be both a den of thieves and a respectable English port, an impossible contradiction. Could a city, like a man, truly escape its past, or was its original sin forever embedded in its very bricks and mortar? This internal decay was mirrored by a growing physical instability that few recognized. The very land the city was built on was a geological death trap. The Palisadoes sandspit was not solid ground. It was a loose, water-saturated deposit of sand and gravel, washed into place by centuries of storms and currents. The constant land reclamation, pushing the city further and further out into the deep water of the harbour, only exacerbated the problem. Every massive brick warehouse, every three-story mansion, was an immense weight pressing down on a foundation with the consistency of wet sugar. Geologically, the city was an absurdity, an act of supreme arrogance. It was a metropolis built on a sandbar, situated perilously close to the boundary of two tectonic plates. Port Royal was a catastrophe waiting to happen, a tragedy written in the language of soil mechanics and plate tectonics, long before the first tremor was ever felt. The city had received warnings. Tremors were not uncommon in Jamaica. Small earthquakes had shaken the island in 1687 and 1690, causing minor damage and a brief flutter of anxiety before being forgotten in the relentless pursuit of profit. Preachers and prophets, fixtures in the city's landscape of sin, issued dire warnings of divine retribution. They railed against the city's wickedness, its pride, its greed, and its debauchery, predicting that God's wrath would surely fall upon this modern-day Sodom. but their cries were largely ignored, dismissed as the ravings of religious fanatics. The merchants counted their gold, the sailors drank their rum, and the city continued its dance on the edge of the abyss. They had conquered the Spanish, they had tamed the sea, they had bent the law to their will. They believed they were masters of their own destiny. They had no idea that their fate had already been sealed, not by a king in a distant land, but by the colossal, slow-moving forces of the Earth's crust, grinding against each other deep beneath the ocean floor. The city's final reckoning was approaching, not with the roar of cannons, but with a low, guttural rumble from the belly of the world. It is the morning of June 7th, 1692. The sun is high and hot in a cloudless sky, beating down on the bustling streets of Port Royal. It is a day like any other. In the harbour, sailors are unloading cargo from a newly arrived ship, their calls echoing across the water. In the market, merchants haggle over the price of silks and spices. In the taverns along Fisher's Row, the first mugs of rum are already being poured, the air thick with the smell of stale ale and fried fish. The president of the Islands Council, John White, is hosting a dinner party. The clink of silver on fine china, a genteel counterpoint to the city's raucous energy. 2,000 souls are crowded into the dense, vibrant streets. They are oblivious. They are living the last 3 minutes of their lives. The clock on the steeple of St. Paul's Church is about to strike 11:43. The first tremor hits. It is a sharp, violent jolt, strong enough to send pewter mugs clattering to the floor and to make the very ground feel like a living thing bucking beneath their feet. A moment of stunned silence, then nervous laughter. Earthquakes are not unknown, but this is just the prelude. Seconds later, the second shockwave arrives, a deep, terrifying roar that seems to rise from the center of the earth. This one is different. It is a long, rolling, liquid motion. The ground is no longer solid. This is the moment the laws of physics are suspended. This is the moment of liquefaction. The water-saturated sand on which Port Royal is built, subjected to the intense vibration of the earthquake, loses all its structural integrity. Instantly, it transforms from solid ground into a thick, soupy quicksand. The city is no longer built on sand, it is built on water. The effect is instantaneous and apocalyptic. The great brick buildings, the pride of Port Royal, the symbols of its permanence, offer no resistance. They do not crumble, they sink. Whole structures, 2 and 3 stories high, vanish into the earth in seconds, their roofs momentarily level with the street before disappearing completely, pulling their screaming inhabitants down with them. The streets themselves become waves of sand, rising and falling in great swells. Fissures, massive cracks in the earth, tear open, hundreds of feet long and dozens of feet wide. People, horses, carriages are swallowed whole. The fissures then snap shut with colossal force, crushing those trapped within. Imagine the terror. Imagine the absolute primal horror of the ground beneath you, the one constant in your life, turning into a hungry, liquid maw. What would you feel? A terrifying sense of betrayal by the world itself, or the cold, final certainty of righteous retribution? The northern part of the city, the waterfront area built largely on reclaimed land, experiences the most complete destruction. In less than a minute, 33 acres of the city containing the wealthiest homes, the busiest warehouses and the most crowded taverns slide directly into the harbour. Fort James and Fort Carlisle, with their massive cannons, collapse into the sea as if they were made of sand. The great church of St. Paul's, its steeple swaying like a blade of grass, collapses into a pile of rubble. Hundreds of people are simply swept into the churning water, crushed by falling debris or dragged down by the undertow of sinking buildings. A man named Lewis Goldie is standing in the street when a fissure opens beneath him. He is swallowed by the earth, but as the next shockwave hits, the fissure reopens, and a powerful upwelling of water shoots him back out, alive, into the harbour, where he is able to swim to a boat. His miraculous survival would become one of the most famous accounts of the disaster. But the horror is not over. As the shaking subsides, the survivors, clinging to wreckage in the harbour, look back at what remains of their city and see a new terror rising on the horizon. The earthquake has displaced a massive volume of water, a tsunami. A colossal wave, estimated to be nearly 6 meters high, gathers itself and roars towards the shore. It crashes over the remnants of the city, sweeping away hundreds more people, destroying the ships that had been anchored in the harbour, and carrying the frigate HMS Swan from its mooring and depositing it on top of a collapsed building in the middle of the town. When the water recedes, it drags countless bodies and a slurry of debris back out to sea. In the space of 3 minutes, 2/3 of the wickedest city on earth has vanished. 2,000 people are dead, with 3,000 more fated to die in the coming days from injuries and disease. The silence that falls afterward is broken only by the cries of the wounded and the gentle lapping of the waves against a coastline that has been violently, irrevocably redrawn. The great social experiment of Port Royal is over, drowned in a churning soup of sand, seawater, and sin. The dawn of June 8, 1692, reveals a scene of almost unimaginable devastation. The glittering, arrogant city is gone. In its place is a shattered ruin, a jagged scar on the landscape. The harbour, once filled with the proud masts of ships, is now a floating graveyard, choked with the bodies of the dead, bloated and pale in the morning sun. They float alongside splintered timbers, shattered furniture, and the pathetic debris of thousands of ruined lives. The northern, wealthiest section of the city has completely vanished beneath the waves, its location marked only by a few protruding rooftops and the spire of a sunken church, a final, futile finger pointing towards a heaven that offered no salvation. On the land that remains, a landscape of rubble and gaping fissures, the survivors wander in a state of shock, their faces masks of disbelief and horror. The air, thick with the dust of collapsed buildings, now carries a new smell, the stench of death. This post-apocalyptic landscape immediately gives birth to a new, more desperate form of wickedness. The initial shock gives way to a grim struggle for survival, and for many that means preying on the dead and the dying. From the nearby shores and even from among the survivors themselves, gangs of looters descend upon the ruins. In small boats and on makeshift rafts, they navigate the treacherous, corpse-filled waters of the harbour, their destination the sunken houses. They use long poles with hooks to fish for floating treasures and to pry valuables from the submerged rooms. They strip the rings from the fingers of the dead and the necklaces from their necks, a final, ghoulish act of piracy in a city that had lived by the sword. On shore, a similar horror unfolds. The wounded are robbed as they lie in the rubble, and vicious fights break out over scraps of food and caches of salvaged rum. The thin veneer of civilization, which the city had so desperately tried to cultivate in its later years, was stripped away in an instant, revealing the raw, savage core of human nature that had always lurked beneath. The disaster was immediately interpreted through a religious lens. Preachers who had survived the cataclysm saw it as the ultimate vindication of their prophecies. This was not a natural event, they thundered from atop piles of rubble. This was the righteous judgment of an angry God. Port Royal, the new Sodom, had been smote for its sins of pride, greed, lust, and blasphemy. This narrative took hold with incredible power, spreading throughout the Americas and back to Europe. The story was no longer just about an earthquake, it was a divine morality play, a terrifying lesson for a sinful age. This religious hysteria fueled the birth of the legends that would come to define the sunken city. Sailors began to tell tales of ghost ships sailing from the submerged port at night, manned by skeletal crews. They swore they could hear the tolling of the bells from the sunken church of St. Paul's, a mournful, ghostly peal rising from the depths. The sunken treasure of Port Royal was said to be cursed, bringing ruin and death to any who dared to touch it. The city of the dead was becoming a city of ghosts. In the days and weeks that followed, the situation for the survivors worsened. With the city's infrastructure destroyed, there was no fresh water. The thousands of rotting bodies, both human and animal, contaminated the harbour and the surrounding land, leading to deadly outbreaks of cholera and typhoid fever. The destroying angel, as one survivor called it, continued its work. Many who had miraculously survived the earthquake succumbed to a slow, agonizing death from disease. The once mighty Port Royal was reduced to a miserable camp of desperate refugees huddled amidst the ruins, haunted by the ghosts of their past and stalked by the spectre of pestilence. The lesson was brutal and clear. The forces of nature had erased the city, but the consequences of human action, the greed and the violence, continued to poison the living. Faced with total collapse, would you attempt to rebuild society on the principles of cooperation, or would you prioritize your own survival above all else? Your choice in the comments will reveal whether you belong to the old Port Royal or a new world. The city was dead, but its fabulous wealth lay just beneath the surface of the water, a tantalizing prize for the brave, the foolish, and the greedy. Almost immediately after the tremors stopped and the great wave receded, the first attempts at salvage began. This was not archaeology, it was a frantic, desperate treasure hunt. The English crown, ever pragmatic, saw the sunken city not as a tragedy, but as a lost treasury. Official salvage operations were commissioned, offering a share of the recovered wealth to any who would risk the treacherous dive. They were joined by countless others, opportunistic sea captains, former pirates, and desperate survivors, all hoping to retrieve a fortune from the watery grave. The age of the first treasure hunters had begun, and with it, a new chapter of danger and death in the story of Port Royal. They sought gold and silver, but they would find a city frozen in time, a silent, eerie world that would guard its secrets jealously. The methods they used were primitive, clumsy, and extraordinarily dangerous. The primary tool was the diving bell, a technology that had existed in some form for centuries, but was still a terrifying contraption. Imagine a large wooden barrel or a lead-sheathed cone open at the bottom. It would be lowered from a ship into the water, trapping a pocket of air inside. One or two men would huddle on a small bench within this cramped, dark space, breathing the stale, rapidly depleting air. As the bell descended, the immense pressure of the water would force the air to compress, pushing the water level up inside the bell, sometimes to their chests. From this precarious perch, suspended in the murky depths, they would venture out for brief, desperate forays, holding their breath as they worked to attach ropes to cannons, pry open chests, or gather scattered coins from the seabed. Their only light was what little filtered down from the surface, turning the underwater city into a landscape of menacing shadows and distorted shapes. For these early divers, the sunken city was a place of profound wonder and mortal terror. Through their eyes, we get our first glimpse of the underwater Pompeii. They described entire streets perfectly preserved, with brick houses standing intact, their windows like vacant eyes staring into the abyss. Inside one house, they found a dining table still set for a meal, with pewter plates and wine bottles resting where they had been left at 11:43 in the morning. In the streets, the skeletons of victims were found pinned beneath fallen walls or trapped inside carriages. It was a snapshot of the last moment of life, perfectly and horrifyingly preserved. But this silent world was not safe. The divers faced a host of dangers. The ruins themselves were unstable, with weakened walls that could collapse at any moment, trapping a diver. The murky water concealed predators. Sharks were a constant threat, drawn by the activity and the lingering scent of death. The greatest danger, however, was one they did not even understand: the pressure of the deep itself. The divers worked at depths of 30 to 60 feet, and they would often surface too quickly after long periods below. They suffered from a mysterious affliction that they called the bends, a crippling condition that caused excruciating joint pain, paralysis, and often a swift and agonizing death. They were experiencing the terrifying effects of decompression sickness as nitrogen bubbles formed in their blood and tissues. The sea was not just guarding the treasure, it was actively fighting back, punishing those who intruded upon its new domain. Despite the risks, the lure of riches was too strong. Records show that these early salvage operations were remarkably successful, recovering vast quantities of gold, silver, cannons, and other valuables. but the human cost was immense. For every chest of silver brought to the surface, the sea claimed its own price in the lives of the men who dared to enter the silent kingdom of the dead. This era of plunder and perilous salvage continued sporadically for over 2 centuries. Various adventurers and syndicates mounted expeditions to Port Royal, each using slightly more advanced technology but facing the same fundamental dangers. The city became a legend among treasure hunters, a mythical source of untold riches, but their work, driven by profit, was destructive. They used explosives to break apart collapsed structures and retrieve cannons, destroying invaluable historical context in the process. They were searching for treasure, not for truth. They saw the artifacts not as keys to understanding the past, but as commodities to be melted down or sold. The city was being looted a second time, yet, in their crude and greedy quest, they kept the memory of the sunken city alive. Their tales of underwater streets and perfectly preserved rooms fueled the popular imagination and laid the groundwork for a radical shift in perspective. The world was slowly changing, and a time was coming when people would look at the ruins of Port Royal and see something far more valuable than gold. They would see a story, a perfectly preserved moment of human history, waiting to be read. The age of the treasure hunter was ending, and the age of the archaeologist was about to dawn. For nearly 250 years, the story of Port Royal remained one of treasure and ghosts. The city was a place of legend, periodically disturbed by adventurers who blasted its ruins for salvageable metal and scattered coins. They were grave robbers, not historians, and each expedition further damaged the delicate submerged time capsule. The scientific world paid it little heed. Underwater exploration was seen as the domain of salvors and the military, not academics. But in the mid-20th century, a revolution was beginning, one that would transform our ability to explore the deep and, in doing so, rewrite the story of the sunken city. The invention of the self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, or scuba, by Jacques Cousteau and Émile Gagnon, finally gave humans the freedom to move through the underwater world with the grace and precision of fish. This single invention would change Port Royal from a treasure chest to be plundered into one of the most important archaeological sites on the planet. The pioneers who brought this new age of discovery to Port Royal were 2 remarkable and determined individuals: Edwin Link, a brilliant inventor and aviator, and Robert Marks, a tenacious ex-marine and aspiring underwater archaeologist. Link, who had made his fortune inventing the first flight simulator, turned his genius to the problems of ocean exploration. He designed and built his own research vessel, the Sea Diver, equipped with state-of-the-art tools for underwater work, including powerful pumps, airlift dredges for carefully removing silt, and a submersible decompression chamber that allowed divers to work at depth for longer periods without suffering from the bends. In 1959, Link arrived in Kingston Harbour, his sights set on unlocking the secrets of the city he called the Pompeii of the New World. He understood that Port Royal was more than just a collection of artifacts. It was an entire urban environment, sealed in a single moment of time. Robert Marks joined the effort a few years later, bringing a relentless drive and a systematic approach to the excavation. Working with the Jamaican government, Marks and his team began the first truly scientific survey of the sunken city. They meticulously mapped the site, laying down a coordinate grid on the seafloor, just as an archaeologist would on a land-based dig. This allowed them to record the exact location of every single artifact they found, preserving the crucial context that the treasure hunters had destroyed. They were not just collecting objects, they were reconstructing the city, room by room, building by building. The work was painstaking and slow. Divers worked in near-zero visibility, as the fine silt that covered the city was easily stirred up, creating a blinding cloud. They used the airlift dredge, a kind of underwater vacuum cleaner, to gently remove the layers of sediment that had accumulated over the centuries. And as the silt cleared, the city began to emerge from the darkness. What they discovered was beyond their wildest expectations. The The silt, which made their work so difficult, had also been the city's savior. It had created an anaerobic environment, a place without oxygen, which had prevented the decay of organic materials. The archaeologists of Port Royal began to find things that should have rotted away centuries ago. They found perfectly preserved leather shoes and belts, wooden knife handles, the remains of textiles, and even human brains, preserved inside skulls found in a collapsed building. They found a ship, complete with its cargo, resting in what had once been a shipwright's workshop. This level of preservation was unprecedented for a site of this age. Port Royal wasn't just like Pompeii. In some ways, it was better. It was a perfect, hermetically sealed slice of life from the 17th century. The city was no longer just a story of pirates and sin. It was becoming a priceless archive of colonial life, trade, and culture. The focus of the exploration had fundamentally changed. The battle was no longer for gold, but for knowledge. Each recovered object, no matter how mundane, was a piece of a puzzle. A broken clay pipe could tell them about smoking habits and trade routes. The bones of animals found in a kitchen could reveal the diet of the city's inhabitants. A pewter plate stamped with a maker's mark could connect Port Royal to a specific workshop in London. The archaeologists were like detectives at the scene of a crime that was 270 years old, piecing together the story of the victim's life just before the moment of death. This scientific approach revolutionized the field of underwater archaeology, proving that a submerged site could be excavated with the same rigor and precision as any site on land. Port Royal became the training ground for a new generation of archaeologists, and the techniques developed there are still used around the world today. The city that had lived by greed was now serving a nobler purpose, yielding treasures far more valuable than gold, the secrets of its own lost world. The treasure hunters had asked what the city was worth. The archaeologists were asking, who were these people, and what could their lives tell us about our own? The story of Port Royal, as told by its artifacts, is a tale of incredible detail and intimacy. The archaeologists did not just find a city, they found the lives within it, captured in the mundane objects of daily existence. Each artifact is a miniature story, a tangible link to a person who lived, breathed, and died on that fateful June morning. And perhaps no object tells that story more powerfully than a small, simple brass pocket watch. It was recovered from the silt in 1959 by a diver working with Edwin Link's expedition. When it was cleaned, the conservators made a stunning discovery. The earthquake's violence had jammed its hands, freezing them in place. The watch was stopped at 11:43, providing the archaeologists with the exact moment the catastrophe began. This single object, small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, became a symbol for the entire site. Time itself stopped in its tracks. It is a memento mori of chilling precision, a silent testament to the thousands of lives that were about to be extinguished. The excavations revealed a city that was far more complex and globally connected than the simple pirate caricature would suggest. In the ruins of a single merchant's house, archaeologists found Spanish silver bars, pieces of 8 from the mines of Potosi, English pewter, German stoneware, Dutch clay pipes, and, most surprisingly, delicate blue and white porcelain from Ming Dynasty China. These finds shattered the image of Port Royal as an isolated outpost of thieves. It was a major hub in an emerging global trade network. The Chinese porcelain, a luxury item of immense value, proves that the wealth of Port Royal was so great that it could command the most expensive goods from the other side of the world. It tells a story of a pirate who plunders a Spanish ship carrying silver from Peru, sells that silver in Port Royal to a merchant, who then uses it to trade with England for goods that have been imported from China. It is a story of 17th century globalization, written in the fragments of a broken teacup. The digs also gave a voice to the city's ordinary inhabitants. A perfectly preserved tavern was discovered, its shelves still lined with onion-shaped bottles of wine and rum. Pewter tankards and mugs were found scattered on the floor, dropped in the instant the tremors began. Archaeologists could reconstruct the last moments of this establishment, a scene of morning drinking abruptly ended by apocalypse. In another building, believed to be the workshop of a pewterer, they found molds for casting spoons and plates, along with finished and unfinished pieces. It was a craftsman's life, interrupted mid-task. These discoveries paint a vivid picture of the city's economy, of the artisans and tavern keepers who catered to the pirates and sailors. They show us that for every swaggering buccaneer, there were dozens of ordinary people simply trying to make a living in this extraordinary place. But among these relics of daily life, other, more unsettling objects began to surface. In the remains of a humble dwelling, archaeologists found what they believed to be an obeah bowl, an object associated with the folk magic and spiritual practices brought to the Caribbean by enslaved Africans. They found strange amulets and charms, objects whose purpose was not immediately clear, suggesting a rich and complex undercurrent of belief systems operating outside the official Anglican Church. These finds hint at the hidden spiritual life of the city's underclass, particularly its large African population. They remind us that Port Royal was not just a city of English colonists, it was a melting pot of cultures, traditions and beliefs, some of which were practiced in secret, away from the disapproving eyes of the authorities. The city was not just wicked in the Christian sense of sin, it was a place of profound cultural collision, where European, African, and indigenous traditions mixed and mingled, creating a unique and volatile society. These artifacts, the devil's utensils and the merchant's porcelain, tell the true complicated story of the city. Which object do you believe holds a more powerful story? The watch, a precise record of the city's final moment, or the mysterious amulet, a symbol of the hidden beliefs and untold stories of its people? Let us know your choice as it reflects what we seek from the past, facts or secrets. The battle for Port Royal is not over. The city that was destroyed by one cataclysm in the 17th century now faces a barrage of new, insidious threats in the 21st. Its treasures are no longer just threatened by the slow decay of time, but by the relentless pressures of the modern world. The sunken city is a fragile, submerged patient, and its prognosis is uncertain. The very forces that make modern Jamaica function are inadvertently contributing to the destruction of its most important historical site. The harbour of Kingston is now one of the busiest shipping ports in the Caribbean. Massive container ships and cruise liners, some weighing over 100,000 tons, constantly move through the channels near the sunken city. The powerful wash from their propellers churns up the seabed, and the pressure waves they generate can topple the delicate, centuries-old brick walls of the submerged buildings. Each passing ship is like a miniature, man-made earthquake, slowly shaking the fragile ruins apart. Nature, too, continues its assault. The Caribbean is a region of intense hurricane activity, and each major storm that passes over Jamaica scours the seafloor, shifting sediments and battering the underwater structures. Furthermore, the global threat of climate change and rising sea levels poses a long-term danger, altering the very currents and coastal dynamics that have kept the city relatively stable for the past 3 centuries. The delicate equilibrium that preserved Port Royal is being disrupted, and archaeologists are in a race against time to document and study the site before these forces erase it completely. The city survived its own death, but it may not survive our world. It is a profound irony. The culture of global trade and consumption that Port Royal helped to create is now threatening to obliterate its remains. But the most immediate and cynical threat comes not from indifferent natural forces or unintended consequences of commerce, but from deliberate human greed. The legend of pirate gold is a powerful one, and it continues to attract a modern breed of treasure hunter, the black archaeologist. These looters, armed with modern scuba gear and underwater metal detectors, descend on the site under the cover of darkness. They are not interested in historical context. They are interested in profit. They rip artifacts from the seabed, stealing coins, pewter, and anything else they can sell on the lucrative black market for antiquities. Each object they steal is a page torn from the history book, a story silenced forever. The Jamaican National Heritage Trust, the official guardian of the site, works tirelessly to protect it, running patrols and monitoring the area. but the site is vast, and policing it effectively is a monumental challenge. The war for Port Royal's legacy is now fought in the shadows, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse between government patrols and nocturnal thieves. This conflict highlights a central question about our relationship with the past. Who owns history? Is a site like Port Royal the heritage of the Jamaican people, or does it belong to the world? Should it be protected at all costs, even if it means limiting the economic development of the port on which the modern nation depends? Politicians, scientists, business leaders, and the local community all have different stakes and different answers. There are proposals to build new cruise ship terminals and expand port facilities, developments that could bring much-needed jobs and revenue, but would almost certainly destroy large parts of the unexcavated city. The battle for Port Royal is a microcosm of a global struggle, the conflict between historical preservation and economic progress. The city's second death may not come with the roar of an earthquake, but with the quiet hum of bulldozers and the stroke of a pen on a development contract. The ghosts of the past are now threatened not by preachers, but by planners. How did the brutal, filthy, and violent reality of Port Royal, a city of slavers, thieves, and drunkards, transform into one of the most enduring and beloved myths in modern culture? The answer lies in our deep-seated need for stories of rebellion, freedom, and adventure. The real Henry Morgan was a war criminal and a ruthless opportunist, but the character he inspired, Captain Morgan, is a jovial partygoer, the face of a popular brand of rum. The average 17th-century pirate was a desperate, often diseased man whose career was nasty, brutish, and short. But the pirate of our imagination is Captain Jack Sparrow, a charming, witty anti-hero who always wins the day. The shadow of the sunken city looms large over our popular culture, but it is a shadow that has been cleaned up, sanitized, and romanticized until it bears almost no resemblance to the truth. Port Royal did not just create a myth, it became the raw material for a global entertainment industry. The process of transformation began not long after the city's destruction. Books like Alexander X. Kemelin's The Buccaneers of America, a first-hand, albeit heavily sensationalized, account of life among the pirates, became international bestsellers. These books were the true crime podcasts of their day, thrilling readers with lurid tales of torture, treasure, and debauchery. They established the foundational tropes of the pirate genre: the buried treasure, the skull and crossbones flag, the pirate code. But the true turning point came in the 19th century with the rise of romantic literature. Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Treasure Island, published in 1883, single-handedly created the modern pirate archetype. Long John Silver, with his wooden leg and his talking parrot, became the template for every pirate that followed. Stevenson took the grimy reality of piracy and polished it into a thrilling adventure story for boys, stripping away the moral ambiguity and replacing it with clear-cut good versus evil. Hollywood cemented this romantic image in the public consciousness. From the swashbuckling films of the 1930s starring Errol Flynn as the dashing Captain Blood, to the modern multi-billion-dollar Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, the pirate has been solidified as a symbol of rebellion against authority and the freedom of the open sea. In these stories, the pirates are the heroes. They fight against corrupt governors and stuffy naval officers, representing the triumph of the individual spirit over oppressive systems. It is an incredibly seductive fantasy. We conveniently forget that the oppressive systems they were fighting were often the navies trying to stop them from robbing and murdering innocent sailors. We cheer for the pirates' freedom, ignoring the fact that this freedom was built on the brutal exploitation of others, including the countless enslaved Africans who passed through Port Royal's markets. Why do we cling to this myth? Perhaps because the pirate represents a fantasy of a simpler, more direct way of life. In a world of complex rules, taxes, and social obligations, the pirate simply takes what he wants. He is the ultimate libertarian hero, a master of his own destiny. The story of Port Royal, the city that tried to live out this fantasy on a grand scale, becomes a kind of cautionary utopia. We are drawn to its story not just because of its catastrophic end, but because we are fascinated by its audacious beginning. The idea of a place with no rules, governed only by strength and cunning, is both terrifying and deeply alluring. Port Royal created the myth of the pirate, and in turn, the myth keeps the memory of Port Royal alive. But in doing so, it obscures the far more important and disturbing lesson that the real city has to teach us. The glamour of the fiction has allowed us to ignore the warning of the fact. The city's greatest trick was not surviving underwater, but convincing the world that its sins were, in fact, virtues. Today, the ruins of Port Royal lie in a profound and protected silence, a sleeping ghost city guarded by the Jamaican government and a deep blanket of water. It has become a museum of its own demise, a silent monument to a world of breathtaking excess. But its story is not a closed chapter from a distant past. It is a mirror. It is an eternal warning, a lesson that humanity seems determined to ignore, making it more relevant today than ever before. Port Royal was an extreme experiment in what happens when human ambition is completely untethered from consequence, when the relentless pursuit of short-term profit completely overrides any consideration for long-term stability. Does this sound familiar? The city's curse was not supernatural. It was a curse born of human nature and predictable geology, a fatal combination of greed and gravity. Look at our modern world. We build our own glittering metropolises on precarious foundations, not of sand, but of complex financial systems and over-leveraged debt, systems that could liquefy in an instant, triggering a global collapse. We construct our shining coastal cities, Miami, Shanghai, Amsterdam, just inches above a rising sea, betting our future against the undeniable realities of a changing climate. Like the merchants of Port Royal, we build our glorious towers higher and higher, ignoring the tremors of warning from the planet itself. We have created a global economy that, like the pirate economy of the 17th century, prioritizes rapid extraction and consumption, creating immense wealth for a few, while leaving a wake of environmental destruction and social inequality. The spirit of Port Royal is not dead, it is alive and well, and it now operates on a planetary scale. The lesson of the sunken city is that societies that disregard the fundamental laws of nature and morality are inherently self-destructive. Port Royal did not need an external enemy like the Spanish to destroy it. Its destruction was coded into its very DNA from the moment of its founding. The earthquake of 1692 was not a random act of God. It was the physical manifestation of the moral and structural instability upon which the city was built. It was the inevitable collapse toward which the city had been hurtling since its inception. The ground beneath Port Royal simply gave way, unable to support the weight of so much concentrated sin and so much poorly engineered brick. It is a perfect, brutal metaphor. Nature does not judge, it simply responds. When a system becomes too unstable, too unbalanced, it collapses. This is a law that applies equally to geology, ecology, and economics. So what is the legacy of this wicked city? Is it the romantic myth of the swashbuckling pirate, a harmless fantasy for our entertainment? Or is it a stark, chilling case study of civilizational collapse? Perhaps its true legacy is the uncomfortable questions it forces us to ask ourselves. We have excavated its streets and catalogued its treasures, but have we learned its lesson? The quiet ruins at the bottom of Kingston Harbour are more than just a historical curiosity. They are a prophecy. They are a reminder that we are all, in a sense, living in Port Royal, feasting on a volcano, blissfully unaware of the tectonic forces gathering beneath us. The city was killed by a combination of geology and human nature, and while we have mapped the former, we have done precious little to change the latter. The silence from the deep is a question, echoing across 3 centuries. When our time comes, will we be any wiser? The secrets of Port Royal are now guarded by the sea, creating a silent museum of human ambition and its ultimate price. Some argue we should raise what's left of the city, displaying its treasures and its sins for all to see, creating an eternal, brutal reminder of where our appetites can lead. Others believe it should be left to the darkness, allowing the ocean to keep the secrets of a history too dangerous and perhaps too tempting to repeat. What would you choose for our world? A sobering monument that forces us to confront our worst vices, or a merciful oblivion that allows us to hope we can become something better? Write your answer in the comments. Your decision says more about the future we are building than all the treasures of the past.